I'm not going to interrupt you. How are you?
Well, I'm annoyed that she's still going.
No, she's finished.
She's finished?
Yeah, because there were other people outside that were storming in and they were complaining and they said they're going to just
Good.
walk in and start. So I'm sure she has stopped by now. Did you hear that? Did you hear that?
No.
That's what an innovative company does. They give people there's a 7-minute rule, so it could be 7 minutes late.
Okay, and connectivity not working.
Really?
Is anybody else having connectivity problems? Is B better? Connectivity problems. B is better? Yes, B is better. All right, now we're almost ready to go. When the water arrives, we're ready to go. Thank you. All right, is the remote participation rolling and the video going and all that? Okay, if that's the case, then we should probably start reasonably on time. Good morning, everyone. Oh, I've got a nice echo. Sounds very profound. My name is William Drake, and I teach at the University of Zurich, and I am the chair of the non-commercial users constituency in ICANN, which proposed this workshop. NCUC is a network of 350 civil society actors involved in ICANN policy-making processes for global top-level domains. And if anybody's interested to know more about us, we have little brochures at the front of the table that you could pick up. The focus of this workshop is on ICANN globalization and the affirmation of commitments. There was just previously another workshop on ICANN and accountability that was run by my colleague Robin Gross, and I think some of the people, including one of the speakers, is just making his way over from that other discussion. So this is a continuation of that discussion. There was also yesterday morning an ICANN town hall about ICANN's current efforts to enhance accountability. And so basically this panel is building on several discussions that have already happened here at the IGF around ICANN accountability. And it's taking one particular part of the accountability matrix, and that is the affirmation of commitments. The affirmation of commitments is an agreement that was entered into by ICANN and the U.S. Department of Commerce in 2009 to promote ICANN's accountability to the global internet community through a system of multi-stakeholder reviews of its performance in accordance with various public interest criteria. It moderated rather than ended the long-standing relationship between ICANN and the U.S. Department of Commerce and affirmed ICANN's commitment to remain a nonprofit corporation headquartered in the U.S. with offices around the world. The review processes that were mandated in the affirmation of commitments make it a very interesting document from the standpoint of governance. You know, usually when we think about global governance of some international communication space, particularly by, say, a treaty or something like that, you have governments or other actors setting a fixed set.
In the late 1990s, the Clinton administration issued something called the Framework for Electronic Commerce, and it included a variety variety of things, but the one specific to this was a direction to the Secretary of Commerce to privatize and internationalize the management of the domain name system. And this was the result of a historical set of relationships that the Department of Defense and others had with respect to the DNS, things that Vint was involved in, others at the time in that regard. So at the Department of Commerce, NTIA took on this task and this charge, and we did what we normally do, which is we sort of went out for public input and public comment, and we had a public meeting and solicited a lot of input from stakeholders with the creation of a green paper where we proposed a policy on how to do this, and then culminating in a white paper. And in that white paper, and all of this is available online on our website if you really are a glutton for punishment and want to read all of this material, all the comments are there, as well as the sort of thought processes behind all of this. So as a result of that white paper, NTIA asked for a partner in this process. Stakeholders created ICANN. The U.S. government did not create ICANN. This is one of those historical fallacies. People like Vint and others got together and decided this was the best way to do this and created ICANN, at which point the Department of Commerce via NTIA entered into a memorandum of understanding or cooperative agreement. The purpose of that agreement was for us to work together as partners in the process and for the department to give advice and help guide the development of a new organization. And if you look at the MOU as it progressed from the original MOU in 1998 to the last one in 2005, I think. Yeah, it was the last MOU. You'll see the sort of shifting changes of the relationship and shifting focus of the MOU. The original MOU sort of gave some broad guidance about structures and budgets, and then as things progressed, you'd see tasks coming off with some of the lingering issues that needed to be dealt with. And one of the things that was, I think, a main inspiration for us at NTIA was these public comment processes that we had and provided input into how we sort of went into the discussion about the MOUs, really gave an opportunity for public input and oversight's not the exact right word, but sort of, direction setting and evaluation of where things were. So key for us in the sort of culmination of our relationship, which the affirmation was finding a way for there to continue that process, to continue in a creative way, the way for there to sort of be an examination of ICANN's execution of tasks, recommendations on improvements, and continuously doing that. The innovation in the affirmation, and one of the things I think that's made it most effective, is that it was no longer the U.S. government facilitating that or doing that role through our public comment processes, but instead it was an ICANN community processes where each of the review teams that are created are made up of ICANN community members and run through public processes. Each of these review teams does extensive consultation, does its own set of public comments, meets with ICANN community members at ICANN public meetings, puts its comments or its recommendations out for public comment again. This then goes to the board, and the board also puts it out for public comment before they actually implement the recommendations and move forward. So again, I think the important part of this was building trust and accountability and transparency in the system is constant engagement with stakeholders and an ability for people to weigh in and provide change and recommendations. It's been really interesting to watch the conversation and the experience unfold when we were involved in Paul and I negotiating and drafting this in 2009, and I'll say I wasn't 100% sure it was going to work out quite as effectively as it has, but I think it's been very reassuring, and that's because people take it very seriously and participate in the process. But again, the affirmation has been an interesting evolution in the ICANN system, and again, as all things in ICANN, we're at the outset an experiment, and I think we're the head of NTIA is on the accountability and transparency review team as a part of our agreement. We've, as an agency, and as Larry Strickling is the head of the agency, been very involved and very dedicated. And it's been very, again, a very rewarding experience from my perspective to see this work and to see there be change made and ICANN better. And maybe with that, I'll leave it and turn it over to Paul.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Paul, you want to build on that?
Thanks, Bill, and thanks, Fiona, and hello to former colleagues and friends. I was worried that was going to come out. Well, I'm glad it came out the way it did. It'd be nothing worse than saying former friends and colleagues, although that might be true. So context is everything, and I'm really pleased that Fiona has given that transition that will allow the private sector to take leadership for DNS management. The US government would prefer that this transition be complete before the year 2000, to the extent that the new corporation is established and operationally stable. September 30, 2000 is intended to be and remains the outside date. So here we are, 15 years on, and as Fiona also pointed out, there was, I think, about 13 different reports on 9 MOUs over the period from 99 through to 2009. So you can see that all of this is laid out on the ICANN website, but also on the DOC website. You can follow the progress of the organisation over that time, and you can see in the reports the things that it has done to try and become more stable and accountable. So I want to go straight to the question, which is, so therefore here we are 15 years on. We've had this sort of period from 2009 to now where there's been this new device for accountability by the community in place called the affirmation. And so with this new, later on in the conversation, so that's the first thing. It recognises that the organisation will do certain things, and in turn the US government is committing to the organisation to form those functions, and that's an important point as well. But in addition to that, these reviews that are resident in the document, I think, I'd posit, hold the community accountable. Because the way they are set up, the community members have to participate in them and have to work hard in order to hold the organisation accountable. So there's a terrific reciprocity in this. And so for that reason, I think, and I won't go on about this, I'll give the other panel members an opportunity to talk a little bit about this. But for that reason, I think going directly to the overarching question that's before the panel, it's an uncategorical yes from me. Sounds a little bit like the X Factor. But I want to make one other point, which goes to what Fiona was saying about the conversation that apparently took place. Unfortunately, I was unable to make it, but apparently took place a little earlier. And I was really, in the session before this, I was really interested to hear that people were saying that the organisation's not ready. And what more could it do in order to be ready, and speculating about what else it could do to be ready. One of the things that marked out the JPA process was these notices of inquiry that Fiona referenced. These were processes, as she said, where the DOC, the NTIA, went out to the community and asked questions about whether or not the organisation was ready. What more could it do to be ready? Right? In the the second to last response to one of these NOI processes that the ICANN board put together in response, they addressed that question directly, which was, could ICANN do more? Because that's what the question the community was being asked. And I also want to read from the letter that the board sent in response, which is basically says, significant progress has been made against all of the relevant measures during the period of the JPA, and they refer to, in the document, the things that have been done and outlined in an attached table. For each of the 13 reports so far, that's always been the case. The focus of the organisation and its innovative model of multi-stakeholder participation's always been and always will be progress and evolution. That's the model's great value. It's in constant improvement. So security and stability is a never-ending pursuit. Operational excellence is a never-ending pursuit. Transparency and accountability is a never-ending pursuit. The conclusion that there is always work to be done can be made of each of the 10 responsibilities that the board referred to in this document. And this is the real money quote for me. This is the real important quote. To ask, could more be done by ICANN, is a question that will always lead respondents to say, yes, ICANN can do more. But ICANN believes that there should always be more done. To conclude that it can do no more is the antithesis of what ICANN needs to be and aspires to be. As a flexible, responsive private sector entity with global stakeholders, it must always do more. And so I want to put that on the table as a reflection that might migrate us from the conversation that we've just had to the one that we're having here, or in fact might just reinvigorate the conversations that took place in the last session as I understand them. So I think with those few reflections, I'll leave it there, Bill, and pass on to Vin.
Thank you very much. Before we turn to Vint, I'd actually like to ask a quick follow-up to you, too, because I think it helps to set up the larger question. When you had the draft of the text, you did a magical mystery tour to meet with governments, I believe, and talk with some and get their input on it. Is that correct? And if so, what kind of feedbacks did you get from other governments about this new mechanism, and how would this really work, and how does it stand in relation to a traditional kind of governance instrument? Was there interesting stuff there that can be said?
Yeah.
Yes, I think what Bill's referring to is before we actually announced the affirmation of commitments, NTIA did a little bit of outreach to some of our key allies and partners around the world, and went to 4 or 5 different countries. And we didn't actually put text on the table and say, hey, what do you think? Will you sign off on this? But we did have a conversation about the evolution of the system and where things were in the global dialogue post-WIS system, where we were, and explained what we were trying to do as a concept, which was providing a way for the global community through the ICANN community process to actually evaluate and provide, basically grade ICANN's progress. And yeah, there was a lot of support for that. And when we actually did finally release the affirmation of commitments at NTIA and ICANN on that day, we got sort of universal endorsement and support of this as an approach, not just around the world via other people issuing press statements and The Economist and news articles and things like that, but also in Washington on Capitol Hill and by a lot of stakeholders around the world. So the idea and the concept and the model of what we were putting forward as sort of a collective governance system and empowering people, and I think Paul's point, this cycle of, being on a review team is hard work. Like, it's a lot of work. And I think people get on these review teams sometimes and don't fully appreciate what's coming at them. But ICANN staff can't summarize documents for you because you're reviewing the work of ICANN. And I think, your point you just made is an excellent one, which is it's a constant way to involve everybody and a constant way to make oversight. But yes, we did get sort of support. I will say, though, that when we talked to people, and this was in 2009, and we said, this is where we think we're going, and some people were like, yeah, that's great, but what about that IANA functions contract? So even then, that was the response we got from people.
And I do apologize for the terrible auditory situation in this room. It's really, I hope people do hear us well. It's a little maddening to hear all the roar from outside at the same time. So against this backdrop, then, we're now moving into an era where ICANN seeks to become a more globalized entity, where we're looking to loosening the relationship in some ways with the U.S., stepping back from its historic stewardship function of the IANA, and we're thinking about how ICANN can establish more of a credible, strong global presence. They've been opening up hubs in a couple of cities and representative offices, various places, trying to globalize the staff, do other kinds of things, etc. The question remains, though, how, if at all, does the AOC need to evolve in light of that globalization effort? Can we maintain it just in the same way? Should it be altered in any manner? Can be built on, etc.? So that's where I wanted to try and get some new discussion going. And somebody who's already done some thinking on this is Vint Cerf. So Vint, if you could share your thoughts.
There we are. Thank you very much, Bill. Well, I think I will try to reflect on the output of one of the high-level panels that were created by ICANN. Specifically, this one was on looking at the ecosystem of the Internet. So it looked well beyond just ICANN. It looked at the literally dozens, if not hundreds, of organizations that are a part of the Internet ecosystem. And that includes the private sector, it includes the governments, it includes the civil society, academic and technical community, and the like. The question that this committee tried to address is what kinds of documentation would be helpful to understand what was going on in this ecosystem, and in the interest of transparency, what kinds of commitments had the various actors in the ecosystem made with each other. The affirmation of commitments was a very good example of a mutual recognition of obligation and responsibility between, in this case, ICANN and the U.S. government. So the committee seized on the idea of commitment, mutual commitment, or maybe even a group commitment that would be able to document who had responsibility for what actions, and if there were a disagreement between the parties who had made this recognition of mutual responsibility, was there a mechanism for resolving those disagreements or those disputes. And so this is not only an assertion of responsibility and acceptance of obligation and recognition of authority, but it was also a mechanism for documenting how disagreements would be resolved. The existing affirmation of commitment between ICANN and the U.S. government is not symmetric relative to all the other governments in the world, because it singled out the United States government as having this relationship. No other documented relationships between ICANN and other governments existed. The committee concluded that there were probably two kinds of commitment, affirmations of commitment that might be considered. If there were to be replicated commitments between ICANN and other governments, including the U.S. government, they should probably be uniform. And the reason for this is that they should be symmetric, that no government should have any special authority or responsibility above and beyond any other. This would remove the current asymmetry between the U.S. government and all other governments with regard to their relationship to ICANN. So we could imagine a kind of common affirmation of commitment between ICANN and any government wishing to establish that documented relationship. But ICANN also has relationships with other parties that are very specific to responsibility. So as an example, with regard to IP address allocation, there is a very specific set of agreements between ICANN and the 5 regional internet registries and their umbrella organization, the Number Resource Organization, which documents what the expectations are of ICANN and the expectations of the RIRs and the relationship they have between them. For example, the regional internet registries are responsible for managing the further allocation of IP address space to third parties like the internet service providers, but they're also responsible to ICANN for developing a global policy which ICANN's IANA function would adopt and use, assuming that the board of ICANN approves it. So we have, that's a very specific kind of relationship. Similarly, ICANN has all kinds of relationships with generic top-level domain operators. It has other kinds of relationships with CCTLD operators. The committee concluded that documentation of all these various relationships and assumptions that were made about obligations and responsibility would actually be very useful for all of us, because the community would become much more, the commitments among the parts of the community would become much more visible. So the conclusion is that maintaining this notion of affirmation of commitment and extending it to a variety of other parties that are part of the ecosystem, many of whom might have relationships quite independent of ICANN, would be a good thing for the internet as a whole. And so I sit on the side of continuing to use these mechanisms, the affirmation of commitments, as a way of documenting the relationships and making them transparent. And I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman.
Vint, can I just ask, in your discussions of that topic, I mean, it's a very provocative and interesting way of reducing the asymmetry, as you put it. Was there much discussion of the transaction costs entailed in developing a web of commitments as opposed to some more streamlined approach?
So, well, the first observation is that a lot of these commitments already exist, and they are documented. There are RFCs that document the IETF relationship with IANA and ICANN. There already exist documents relating ICANN to the RIRs. There are documents about the RIRs' relationship to each other. So the honest answer is that many of these kinds of relationships already have nascent documentation. And so the value of this sort of documentation, particularly the value of deciding ahead of time while you're still in a cooperative mode about what you will do when you are not cooperating because you're in disagreement, that's really valuable. Any lawyer will tell you that whenever you have a contractual relationship, the best time to figure out how you will deal with a dispute is while you're still friends. So in fact, this is a very important element of this notion of affirmation of commitments.
Okay, so essentially standardizing things already in place in a lot of cases. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Benedicto, what do you think about all this?
Thank you, Bill. Well, I will try to reflect a little bit from a somewhat different angle, being from government, which normally does not participate so actively in those discussions. I'd like to indicate our understanding that government should, at least from the part of my government, we see our participation as part of what is called the community. So we are very comfortable in working together with all other stakeholders towards trying to make our best and to improve the existing system. We have applauded the US announcement of March 14th. We think this indeed is something that we, as our national position, we have been asking for a long time. So it was a very welcome decision. And we don't see that those somewhat conditions that were spelled out, we don't see those in the light of something that was arbitrarily imposed by the US, but rather these are parameters, and those are assumptions that have guided us through, so we are very comfortable in working in that context. Being from government and having maybe a more political perspective on this transition process, I would comment that we think it would be a missed opportunity if, as an outcome of this transition exercise we are all engaged in, the proposal for transition would be limited to the issue of replacing the contracting arrangements or the administrative operation and not touch on accountability and transparency. So we think that should go as a single undertaking. The package should include this, because looking from the political angle, it is important that this exercise will enhance the legitimacy ICANN has, not only in regard to those insiders, the inner participant, but to the larger community involving countries that are not usually so much involved in this operation, and some of those are completely outside, and of larger populations that also do not participate. So we think it is important that ICANN should be seen by the larger community, and I think it's very important that we are having this discussion here at IGF, which embodies this concept. I think this, indeed, that will be a missed opportunity if we don't take this opportunity to include elements that will add to the legitimacy. And in that sense, I would only highlight our understanding that ICANN is completely different from other organizations. We have been listening that ICANN has already in place accountability mechanisms that can even be assumed to be more important than other organizations. Those exist in other, but ICANN is a completely different case. ICANN is an organization which manages resources that could maybe be termed global commons that impact on everyone's lives around the globe. So I think the kind of accountability required from ICANN is in its nature different from one that would be required from other organizations. So from that sense, clearly there is a clear perception that what is in place now is insufficient. It needs to be reinforced, adding some external kind of oversight of binding instruments, I will not be in a position to elaborate too much on this. We look forward to the discussion on those aspects, but I would put emphasis on this notion of the perception from the outside world of what is taking place here, and this clearly has to be reinforced. As I said, we do not have answers. I do not have any preconceived ideas on this. In regard to the affirmation of commitments, we have been hearing some interesting ideas. Should some of those elements be built in the ICANN bylaws? Should those be, as it was stated just before, somewhat be replicated and form a web of, I don't have an answer for this. I'd look forward to participate in dialogue around those. But in regard to the accountability and transparency elements that we think are important to be included, I think there might also be, it is important to decide on the scope of this. We would, of course, be very much interested that the process would not be delayed too much, that it would not take years for us to maybe reflect on so many detailed aspects that maybe in the end will be very difficult to solve. But at the least, I think there might be some consensus on those elements, key elements that will help to build that idea of that perception of accountability. So I think this is something. But from the starting principle, I think no topic should be seen off limits for the discussion, because in some sense we are now in a founding moment. I think it's, we have clearly a perception that the US decision has put for all of us the challenge to look at what we have put in place and developed over the years, and there are we acknowledge the many successes that have been achieved through the operation of ICANN. So there is a recognition, and on the part of my country, a very robust participation from stakeholders in its operation. So we are very much committed to the operation and not to derail in any way its functioning. But at the same time, we think there is an opportunity to improve, and we would very much contribute to that. Probably what we need, and I refer to something Avri Doria was mentioning a number of times in the previous panel, that we need something in between. I think we have extremes, some saying that we don't need much, that what is in place and the mechanisms are already sufficient, can be improved, but should be detached from the transition IANA per se process, and some would maybe have a very ambitious targeting, looking into all the aspects. Maybe we need something in between and come up to a consensus on what elements should be there. But clearly, the process should not be limited. And in regard to affirmation of commitment with each of these, again, I think there are a number of ideas. I think in principle, it would be beneficial for and even consistent with the decision that was taken by the US, that also the affirmation of commitments would be replaced by some global arrangement as well. But again, I do not have an answer for that. I look forward to the discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedicto. It's clear that the AOC is an internal mechanism for accountability, but for the external part, to those not involved, remains an issue there. Okay, Henriette Esterhuizen, please. What do you think?
Bill invited me as the person that knows very little about ICANN. I think just my reflections will really be not on the IANA transition, but more broadly, kind of the story of ICANN from somebody who's been involved in the internet for a very long time. You know, it started, and it started in the US. There was a consultative process. Not a very global process, and you know, we were a little bit peeved. I lived in South Africa, but we thought something needs to happen, we'll go with it, and it strengthened and it worked. And since then a lot has happened. The affirmation on commitments, a major initiative that changed a lot and set into motion the accountability and transparency review. Again, a major process, lots of engagement with the community, recommendations coming before ICANN board. Since then, even more. ICANN constantly has changed, the internet has changed, and then we've had, for example, the panel that Vint talked about also has come up with recommendations. The ideas of affirmation of commitments used with specific communities or interest groups, and in general, just increasing investment, expansion, but also in accountability, in participation, in transparency. But what amazes me is that in all this time, the ICANN corporate governance structure has not changed. And there's just something illogical. To my knowledge, it hasn't changed in the sense that, you know, structure is there to serve function. And it seems to me that the step that now should be taken is to really review that structure in the context of all the effort that has been put into participation, transparency, and accountability, in all the community feedback, positive and negative and critical, the recommendations, and review that and really look at how the current ICANN incorporated in the US, and I know there will be concerns about that, but I think even if that has to be addressed at another level or at a different stage, I think just investing in adapting and modifying and amending the current structure to make it a neater fit and a more accountable fit to what ICANN is doing and ICANN's role in the internet community seems to me very logical. And I won't go into much detail about that, but essentially I think what I find problematic about the current structure is that you essentially have a board and a CEO, and that's it. Now, that board is constituted in a bottom-up way, supposedly, but once it's there, its accountability is to ICANN, the institution. And what happens then in relation to those board members' accountability to their constituencies is actually, how does that really work? They need to be accountable to them. They need to fulfill the mandate they might be getting officially or unofficially. But it is not a very structured form of accountability. So I think using affirmation of commitments in the way that Vint is suggesting is a very creative idea, but I think even that will not be enough if that is then not reflected at a structural level in the corporate governance structure of the organization. And through creating members, a membership layer is one example, or different membership layers. And because what I think you need in ICANN, you do need a board that plays a role in supervising the CEO, managing and making sure the staff fulfills the mandate of the organization. But you also need, at a structural level, a role for the community and the interest groups, be they governments, civil society, business stakeholders. There are many different specific ones in the ICANN community that have a formal, official, legislated role in terms of the corporate governance structure in setting the organizational policy and direction and accountability procedures.
Thank you very much, Henriette. Okay, let me ask, before we go to the audience, if anybody on the panel would like to respond to anything that each other said. I thought you might, Vince, so go ahead.
So, I have three specific observations, assuming I can read my own handwriting. First of all, I think mechanisms for recourse may be central to all of this. If somebody feels that they haven't been properly treated, there have to be mechanisms for responding to that. And it could very well be that ICANN needs to improve its range of available recourse mechanisms. So that's one observation to make. And by the way, Henriette, I am trying hard to lay the groundwork for an argument that says we don't necessarily need structural change. So this might be part of our further discussion. The second thing is that ICANN has repeatedly demonstrated its ability to adapt in response to self-examination by the sectors that make up the multi-sector, multi-stakeholder model. And I think it deserves a good deal of credit for that. not all organizations will take input that says you should change and actually do that. And there have been some pretty massive changes of organizational structure. And Henriette, I'm sure you must recall the period around 2003 or so when there was a very significant change in the way in which the organization was managed and structured. And there have been subsequent ATRT responses as well. And so I think that that's an important factor. And finally, I have this discomfort with the level of scrutiny that we're giving just to ICANN. Now, it's not that I'm going to argue that every element of the internet ecosystem should be placed under the microscope, and I just want to remind you that every single one of you relies on an enormous number of organizations to make the internet work. And we don't have this level of microscopic examination on every one of them. The resolver that you happen to connect to because your ISP provides that is not subject to a multi-stakeholder affirmation of commitments, then we're not asking for that. So it's just possible that we are perseverating excessively on one piece of the internet ecosystem and perhaps not necessarily. So I'll let that be a provocative piece of the debate.
Thank you, Vinto. It's certainly true that many people have advocated doing more to promote transparency and inclusive participation and accountability across the ecosystem, but the point that this one takes particular energy is undeniable. Fiona, yes.
Maybe just to comment on a response to one thing Henriette said, and it's not my place or NTI's place to say whether corporate governance and the corporate structure needs to be changed. I expect this will be a theme of the conversation in the enhanced accountability process. But I think from our perspective, you know, we've always seen the role of the board to sort of be endorsing the consensus that comes from the community process. And I think Jonathan Zook is in the room. He said this in the earlier session. I think what we've seen over the years is the community failing to come to consensus and sending it to the ICANN board to resolve, and that may be something folks need to start taking a look at. So when we're talking about enhancing the accountability of ICANN and the ICANN system, we need to be looking at not just the board or the staff. ICANN is much more than that, and maybe it's a look at the different structures of ICANN. You know, NTI does represent the U.S. government inside the Governmental Advisory Committee as well, and there's been, you know, a fair amount of churn about getting governments more involved in the process earlier as opposed to how things has worked. So, I mean, there's a lot of parts of this to take a look at, but at the end of the day, our view has always been the role of the board has been to sort of reflect and sort of confirm that consensus has been achieved through the bottom-up process, and maybe we should be taking a look at what's happening in that bottom-up process as well.
Fair enough. By the way, I should remind us all to speak clearly and slowly for the translators and people who are not native English speakers. Benedicto?
Yes, two brief comments, just repeating things I had said before. I think ICANN has unique characteristics that require, and for that reason, maybe unique also methods for accountability, transparency, and the reflection on the should be required. And not forgetting that ICANN is committed to fulfill the public interest, to serve the public interest, which in itself differentiates together with the aspect of managing a global common. So I think those aspects lead to very different requirements from its operations. The second comment, and again referring to something I said else, in principle, our best recommendation, our best understanding of the situation is that nothing at this juncture should be off limit. Even the issue regarding the governance, the structure, why not discuss, since we are engaged in a new era, why shouldn't we take a fresh look at what we have and collectively try to figure out what would serve best the system, what would best serve the multi-stakeholder way of doing things we are trying, and ICANN is one of the best examples for that. So I don't think I think we would very much appreciate if we could have a very open discussion, not controlled by anyone. I think some of the interventions that have been made in the process, if they were coming from a government, I can easily assume that there would be an outcry and people would be really exasperated about that. And some participants have very concrete interventions in the process, and they are, in a way, incorporated. So we would like very much to see a very honest, frank discussion. I don't think anything should be left out of the table unless there is a collective decision to do so. Thank you.
Do you want that discussion to be happening before the IANA transfer was completed? You would.
The only thing is to maybe to limit the scope for the discussion, because as I said before, there are so many elements to be included that maybe we should decide what are the crucial elements that should be included.
Okay.
I would agree with that. Just to come back a little bit to why I'm advocating structural reform, but I'm advocating actually, Vint, not anything very dramatic. It's maybe even intermediate. You know, companies change their governance structure. All institutions change their governance structure. It's a very usual thing. You do that as your context changes. So I'm actually not advocating anything terribly dramatic. I think my concern is that more mechanisms, more appeals procedures, for example, I think this was mentioned in an earlier workshop, can actually just increase the burden on the existing governance structure, maintaining the required level of accountability. Because the more mechanisms you introduce, the more you have to maintain accountability and transparency around. So that's why I think ease the burden, look at separation between structure and then the functions and processes of public participation and transparency. And accountability lives in both dimensions, obviously. And I mean, simply just looking at something like a two-tier structure, where at the moment you have all these communities and constituencies in ICANN, and they are their only real influence, if I understand it correctly at the moment, is by electing board members. But create another structure where they are actually that structure. And that would also change how that structure, that second tier structure, you can call it a member layer or a constituency layer, but it's inside the governance layer of the organization, would immediately make a difference, because then you could have separation between the executive function and the governance function, and you can play around with that, and the policy and procedure function and the oversight of the executive function. So the oversight of the executive could sit with the board, as it does in most corporations, and the oversight of the policy procedures could sit with the members. But just to say why I think this is important, because I think ICANN is trying very hard to solve problems and to respond to concern from the community. But often that has unintended consequences. Take the GAC, for example. In ICANN's many years now response to government's concern about not having enough oversight or control, the role of GAC has been expanded. The prominence of GAC has been expanded. And I went to ICANN, I don't go to ICANN very often, the biggest, the room where you couldn't find a seat was the GAC room. And so my fear is that in this attempt to deal with the concerns that governance hold, you actually end up weakening the influence of other stakeholders, such as civil society, for example. So you deal with a problem and you deal it with in a way that actually creates new problems. I think there's a whole integrated set of problems, and government's concerns is one of those. I think they need to be looked at as a whole, and then looked at how the structure can best as a whole change to respond to those problems.
Just to be very clear about that my government, I cannot speak for all governments, my government does not see that the participation of governments and the kind of input governments can instill in the process would be to the detriment of any other stakeholder. I want to make it very clear. We think we have been working in Brazil in the context of Brazilian Steering Committee, in which all sectors sit around the same table, all discuss, all bring their inputs, and the final decision we think is improved by that. And that's the kind of, I think, governance or structure maybe ultimately, maybe not at this point in time, but we would like to see. I'll give a very concrete example. We are not concerned about the inputs coming from the IETF or IAB. I think that's not part of the concern of government in this process. But I think the kind of process that our concern would have to be more influential, and to the extent that the advocacy of our positions could be better made in the context of some decisions that are taken by the board. For example, in regard to the GTLD program, we think, well, I should speak for my government, not as GAC, I do not have this mandate, that the process itself should have been much more improved if governments could have had a role in putting their inputs and indicate some safeguards that might be necessary before the program was approved, not trying to address some of those problems that are happening now. So that's the kind of thing that maybe is part of the concern. I want to be very specific about that. That would not be to the detriment of others, but rather trying to improve on the mechanisms. Thank you.
Just real quickly from Vint and Paul, and then I want to open it to the floor. I see a large number of internet governance and ICANN mavens here, so I want to give everybody a chance to talk. So just briefly.
This is short. Just a couple of observations. The first thing is that the more pieces you build that have interaction with each other, the more complicated things get and the more brittle things become. So if there is structural change, we need to be very thoughtful about the nature of that change and whether or not it actually creates a better system or one which is potentially completely locked up, in complexity. So I hope, I'm sure Henriette would not be asking us to create a more complicated and more brittle organization.
And real quick, an attempt to bring us back to that word affirmation again. The point that Vint made, I thought, was just an excellent one, which is, this scrutiny on the other organisations, this sort of scrutiny that occurs towards ICANN in the absence of perhaps some of the other organisations, and is even more reason why you perhaps need an affirmation-like document with some of those organisations, so that the community itself can be assured that they're holding those organisations to account and that there's a recognition that's mutual between ICANN and those organisations.
I think that's a very interesting point. Okay, so let's go to the floor. I know that there's a lot of interesting people here. I see the former chairman of the board waving at me already, and he was around when the affirmation happened. So there's a mic. Where's the mic? Could you perhaps take it to people? Okay, so we'll start with Peter. Who else had their hands up? Steve, the gentleman over here. We'll start with you three, and then four.
Thanks, Bill. This is Peter Dengate-Thrush, as you said, the former chairman. I just wanted to pick up a couple of quick points and then I think come back to the theme of the affirmation, and perhaps to start with Henriette. And to agree with Vint, there have been many corporate reorganisations, and I can recall leading one in particular where we took the CCTLDs out of the DNSO, and as a result we formed two completely different support organisations, the major policy development engines in ICANN, the CCNSO for CC policy and the GTLDs. Much more recently there's been a paper suggesting quite a change to the formation and etc. of the nominating committee, and there are sort of very other. So I don't think there's any unwillingness to grapple with these issues, and it's done in the way Benedicto argues for, that they should be fully open. I think it's extraordinary, just on the point, to say that government should have been involved in the new GTLD process before it was approved. The GAC, of course, was the very first body in ICANN to file submissions and produced a very comprehensive set of GAC principles on new GTLDs. I think in about 2007, 2008, was constantly involved in all of the discussions, and in the end, of course, we convened a special out-of-session meeting in Brussels to deal explicitly, before the program was launched, with the concerns of governments. So there's no unwillingness again to grapple with those issues. But if I could come back to the theme of today, really, which I think is the affirmation of commitments. I led the board actually at the time in refusing to sign an extension or a continuation of the joint project agreement, and it was actually that led to the formation of a different mechanism, and it's delightful to see Fiona here still contributing, and it was done in a very open spirit, and I want to congratulate the NTIA, particularly Larry and Fiona, for the effort they've always brought to advancing this in a positive way. And of course, nice to see Paul, who actually drafted, I think, that letter that I signed that you quoted from, Paul. The reason why we wanted to change that was that the previous arrangement continued to treat ICANN as an experiment. It was a trial run, and it required ICANN to report regularly to the NTIA on how it was doing against a set of standards that the NTIA set. And the NTIA would occasionally go out and ask the community to tell it how we were doing. And that was broken and needed replacing. And so we replaced it with a set of affirmations mutually. From my perspective, I always saw the affirmation of commitments as a transition step. I believe that ICANN was making those comments and those commitments to the entire global community. It was doing it through a bilateral mechanism, but those are commitments that ICANN made to the world, not necessarily to the US Department of Commerce. And it was never seen as a contract that only the US government could affirm or there was no privity of contract issue. And in fact, we've seen in the ICANN community, ever since then, the community using the affirmation of commitments to argue its points. We've seen it appearing in reconsideration requests. It's become very much part of the fabric. So the fact that it appears in a bilateral agreement has been not inhibitory in any way, and people have used those principles. What should we do with it next, which I think is what this session is trying to grapple with? My suggestion is that the ICANN community should take it upon itself to review the commitments and decide which of those it wishes to continue. Some of those have expired through natural attrition. Some may be up for review, such as maintaining headquarters in the United States. But the community itself should take those commitments that it wishes to continue and include those in its declaratory constitutional documents. There's many opportunities for that, and some of the work that Vince Group done has been helpful there. It could be a unilateral declaration, it could be included in the bylaws or many other mechanisms. The form is not actually that important. It's the taking of them and committing to them, I think, that's important. What we should not do, we should not set it up as an agreement and invite other governments to sign on. Partly because some of it's expired, partly because some of it reflects the unique relationship with the US government, but mostly because it would be a rabbit hole down which we would go with endless renegotiations and work for my brothers in the legal profession forever. That's to be avoided, I think. What we could do is have a web page where governments could sign up to something similar, but I think what's better than documents is actions. What we want is people to show up at the GAC, show up at ICANN, and contribute to the actual discussions. So I think that's how we gradually take the affirmation of commitments and pass it into the current situation, rather than trying to maintain it as this extra document. Thanks.
Peter, just to clarify the last point I didn't catch, were you saying that you could have a standard thing that other governments could adhere to?
Yes.
In a straight way without having to do the negotiating separately?
If you wanted to put a page up somewhere that said, we, the government of country X, agree with these principles, that would be fine. What I suggest you do is get them to come along rather than sign up to documents, but maybe you can do both.
Mm-hmm. All right, interesting. Thank you. Steve?
Steve Delbianco with NetChoice, and just to follow up on Peter's question, in keeping with the title of this session, poor Bill has to report out at the end of the week as to what the answer was to the question of what happens to the affirmation. So I'd be interested in each of the panelists to suggest, what do we do with this wonderful document? Do we leave it alone? Do we ask a bunch of other governments to sign? Or do we import it into the bylaws? But let's see if we can come up with a concise set of consensus among the 5 of you experts up there, so that Bill knows what to tell the general session.
Okay, a provocation to the panel. Would you like to give me one bullet point each on the way forward to address concerns of globalization?
Well, speaking just for myself, and I think I am able to reflect the panel that wrote a report about the web of commitments, we concluded that the existing affirmation of commitments probably had some elements that were very specific to the U.S. government and would probably not be appropriate if you wanted to use a similar document to establish an affirmation, bilateral affirmation of commitments between ICANN and other governments. And so one thing to be done to the document would be to revise it to the point where it would be a useful document for confirming recognition of obligation between ICANN and any government that chose to enter into that transparent relationship.
All right, Peter, or sorry, Paul.
He's going to get a second.
I get them all confused.
Where's Mary?
Yeah, that's right. So I'd just echo those comments, but also coming behind Peter on that point about, there are some elements that are clearly not relevant now, So, for example, at the beginning of the document it says something to the effect of the US government nothing in this document endorses new GTLDs. I'm not sure you need that anymore. That can be removed. There's some references to who is, there's a few other things that are peculiar to the relationship that is historic that I think can probably be taken out. But I always thought and always envisaged, and I must say not in the lead up, not during the drafting process so much as once the drafting was done, looking at it and thinking, actually, this could work as a kind of diplomatic recognition for the organisation. A set of principles that governments and others sign up to and say, yes, we agree that ICANN does these certain things and we commit to them doing those things as long as they commit to doing them. I think that could be actually a very effective device.
And that would take what form?
Beg your pardon?
That would take what form?
So I think something of the like of this document, but with some of the particularities taken out. So something that says ICANN commits to a range of things, and some of the peculiarities that are historic in some respects to the JPA process.
Would that be closer to Vince negotiating bilaterals with each, or Peter's one thing and everybody just goes and fixes?
So I think Vince's point was that you'd have a bifurcated arrangement. So you'd have, which I initially had no doubts about, but having heard him talk about it, I agree entirely with. Which is, so you would have something which was, I think, stock standard is the wrong set of words, but something that, a group of governments and others can, the ITU can agree to sign up to and say, yes, we recognise this organisation as doing these things, and this agreement is of long standing. And then you would also have a set of agreements that would be more tailored to the other organisations that ICANN interacts with. And as Vince says, a lot of that stuff's already written down. It's not a huge net additional amount of work.
Okay. I got a lot of people waving at me from the audience, so we'll try to go quickly. Fiona, your 1 point.
Well, I think like every question, you want a precise answer, you have to ask a precise question. And I'm hearing a couple different things here. And the question is, what purpose that's in the affirmation of commitments are you trying to sustain? And I would argue that the affirmation has a couple of different purposes. One, it was the conclusion of the MOU process, right? So that's the first operative part of the document. It's a very short document, by the way. What ICANN commits to and what NTIA commits to. That's one part of the exercise. The other part of the exercise is the actual setting up of the review teams that's called for. And these are ongoing and continuous and supposed to always be happening and be impaneled by a multi-stakeholder community and providing that review. So I think the question you need to figure out how to ask is what should happen with the affirmation of commitments, but what part of the affirmation of commitments are you looking at? If you're just looking at getting governments and stakeholders to commit to ICANN as being the global coordinator of the DNS, which is what the first two parts do, that's one exercise. The other exercise is the review process themselves. And I would, say again, when we drafted this document and issued it jointly, it was a statement of where we were in time. From our perspective, this document doesn't have an expiration date, but the current structure and process doesn't allow you to actually amend the review process, which after having gone through 2 cycles of ATRT now and seeing the who is and the security one, there might need to be a discussion about what improvements need to be made into the review processes. For example, I can remember when we were discussing and negotiating the time cycle, Paul raising a lot of concerns about the time cycle we were insisting upon, and that probably needs to be considered in the context of the issues themselves, but also ICANN community fatigue and other issues that are going on. This has 4 reviews that are topically specific. I can't imagine you're ever going to get rid of an accountability and transparency review, especially in the context of an institution that's always going to be improving, but there could be new issues to add. Hopefully one day maybe there won't need to be a new GTLD review. I don't know, who knows what's going to happen in the future, and that kind of conversation needs to happen as well. So it's a much longer answer than I normally give and a longer answer to your question, but I think you need to be a little bit more precise in terms of which part of the operation of the affirmations are you asking about.
Okay, so a differentiated approach, but the fundamental point people are asking about is the globalization and the ways in which other governments or actors might connect themselves formally or informally to the mechanism. that's...
Well, and it's always fun to disagree, so I'll disagree. The one thing I would say about that, though, is if you just have a vanilla document that governments can click, I agree, it's not really, that's sort of a pointless exercise. What you actually want is governments agreeing to a set of, commitments, but certainly agreeing that they will only agree to those commitments if the organisation is accountable through a set of reviews to the community. So I do see those two things as linked. I don't think you would. I don't think you'd have those two separated, or a government document being a bland statement of things that it recognises.
I think you two have already kind of indicated a preference. So can I go to my other, or do you? Oh, it's okay. Oh, very quickly,
And
Ben.
I'm trying to respond to Steve's question.
All right. I'm coming to you all. I know.
No, in regard to this issue at hand now, I think, as we have been saying, maybe we need to be innovative, not thinking about just by replicating or making amendments to the existing way of doing things. I think the ideal situation would be for the affirmation committee to be replaced by a kind of global pact, but I think that would not be realistic to think about negotiate something that could be endorsed or accepted by everyone. That would be, I think, an unprecedented exercise. When we are working within government, which is not the case here, we know how to do things, to set an agreement in which we spell out dispute settlements and all the other rules, but how the ideal thing would to be done in a multi-stakeholder fashion, but I don't think that would be feasible. So we are maybe trying to look into more practical ways of doing things. One thing, if I can just respond, when I was mentioning the concern about GTLD, I don't ignore the fact that GAC participated making inputs. My point was that the decision-making process was one in which GAC did not participate, not as with veto power, which is not the case, but with strong advocacy of its points, which were to some extent ignored. And to my understanding, that led to problems later on that are being addressed now. So, and I was mentioning the example we have in Brazil in which the decision-making process involves everyone, so everyone can make its input, defend its position on equal basis and make a decision. I think that serves better the whole system, and this would entail that kind of structural change, which I don't think is the one thing we are focusing now. I was just saying it as, let's say, the ideal world in which if we could have 10 years to discuss, but I don't think it is in our interest to engage that kind of discussion now.
You're not thinking about the T word, the treaty word. You're not thinking about that.
Okay, quick response to Steve. I think the idea, Peter's idea of reviewing the OSC makes complete sense to me. I think then assessing whether there are immediate changes indicated to the bylaws, make them. If not, if it's more complex, appoint a structural governance reform review team to come up with recommendations around that, and then use the mechanism of AOCs. I'm personally concerned, and actually putting this out as a question, bilateral affirmations of commitments with governments, I am not convinced by. And I think Vint and I think we've had this discussion before. I'd like to actually put it out to the panel and the room, whether the idea of then affirmations of commitments with other institutions, and particularly intergovernmental institutions, might not be a more sustainable way to go. Difficult, but more sustainable.
All right, I have the gentleman here who's been waiting very patiently. I have Stefano, I have David, I have Adam, I have Chris. So let's please try to be reasonably concise, because I'm sorry we're not managing time. I'm not managing the time well. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm Ashwin from Indonesia, and I have 2 points actually. Point one is the U.S. government through NTIA have announced that the transfer of IANA should be to a multi-stakeholders organization or institution or something like that. The problem is until now we do not have yet what a multi-stakeholder organization looks like. The US, the Saudi Arabia, the Indonesia, or other countries may have different idea as how a multi-stakeholder platform should look like. If by ICANN 51 next October, we do not have a consensus as how a multi-stakeholders organization that will receive and run IANA will looks like, what will happen? Will the NTIA delay that from transferring IANA from 2015 to 2016, from 2016 to 2017, and so on, until we have a global consensus? Or we just run like what we have today, run by NTIA with a contract to ICANN, and if some countries doesn't want it, and they can make their own intranet. Just like the similarity we can see at the GPS system. When the US run the GPS, everybody use the GPS for our mobile phone, finding our area. But when you are not happy with the GPS, the European make Galileo, the Russian make GLONASS, and everybody would who doesn't want to use GPS, just send another 20 or 30 satellites up there, and you have another GPS. And it has happened in the GPS system. So what makes me worry is, will it also happen in the internet system? Thank you.
Certainly a provocative question. Okay, then thank you very much. And then we have Stefano. We'll come back and answer them collectively. I want to get the questions on the table.
Okay, I will be brief. First of all, ICANN was born as an experiment. Someone said that is good, of a multi-stakeholder organization with the private sector leadership. The present CEO and president likes to call a multi-equal stakeholder organization, just in order to give it the idea that there is more, let's say, listening to everybody before deciding. But ICANN needs a decision-making capability. This is very important. Let's a little bit about the governments. It is true that recently the role of the governments in the GAC has improved a lot. If we look at the affirmation commitments and the 4 review panels to judge the behavior of ICANN, then the chair of the GAC is always...
Government made it bilaterally. Not about the content that much. It's a starting point. Let's review it. Let's make it better. And let's keep ICANN to it by keeping these reviews in place. And for sure, let's not make the mistakes of just asking other governments to sign up to. Let's ask the community to condone this.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Let's go to the panel for quick responses. We had questions from the gentleman in front about what does multi-stakeholderism look like from the standpoint of Indonesia, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, etc. Might be different, and what happens then if there's a desire for a separate system. I saw Fiona looking interested by that one. Stefano about the GAC becoming more operational, etc. David's question about review teams and the extent to which the U.S. was really a focus of that. Adam's question on the ability of governments to come into relations with a California nonprofit. Matt on reconciling the IANA step back with something new on the AOC. Pat, question on the exit and the speed and putting things in the bylaws, and Martin's question just there. Who would like to take any of those points? I just pick and choose as you want, respond to what you want, starting with Fiona.
So maybe I'll start with the gentleman from Indonesia and the question on timing. So the current IANA functions contract, if all the options are extended, is a 7 years contract. So this is the way we do contracting in the U.S. government. We do a base period, and then we have automatic extensions should we choose to actually extend it. So the base period of the current contract expires September 30th of 2015. That's a statement of fact, and it is part of the process. The U.S. government, should the process and the community need more time, we can automatically extend the contract for 2 years and then 2 years after that. So again, I know there's been a lot of conversation about it's all got to be done by next year. Next year is a milestone in the contracting process, and the date is a statement of fact. But should the community and people need more time to get this done and this correctly, September 30th is not the end-all be-all for next year, just to clarify that for you. And maybe some of the other questions, I mean, I think to Dave's point, the fact that people that participate in the review teams never saw this as about the U.S. government is great and great to hear, and I think that's the part of this, which is, again, the review teams, we as the U.S. government have nothing to do with selection of the review teams. We participate in the accountability and transparency one. We provide comments to all the other ones as part of the ICANN community. So again, everyone's participating in the process, and that's something to keep in mind. I agree with Matthew, actually. And again, I think part of this is the conflation of the broader ICANN enhanced accountability conversation that's happening due to us saying we're willing to take on the idea of transitioning our role with the ICANN stewardship, and Bill's question, which was globalization of ICANN, and will government signing the affirmation do that? But I think it's a fair point. If we're looking at broader globalization of ICANN and we're looking at the multi-stakeholder model, does having governments as governments sign agreements, undermine that multi-stakeholder model is a great question and something that needs to be considered. And I think Pat's question, it's actually 3 months. It's actually 120 days, I think, that's in the agreement. Under the current affirmation of commitments, either ICANN or NTIA could terminate the agreement. For our part, NTIA has no current plans to terminate the affirmation of commitments. But again, as we look at going forward, and as we look at effectuating the IANA transition, once proposals are developed that enjoy consensus and have all these issues addressed, we do have to do the stress testing, and I think that they're now called the Del Bianco stress tests. So Steve gets the full credit for that, to make sure the system is protected and preserved. And this is something I would expect the Enhanced Accountability Group, once it gets going, takes up. What's in the affirmation? What needs to be maintained? What if it expired? What would you do? And again, these are all great questions people should take up and address and talk through, and things we need to understand as we go forward.
The point about whether it could undermine the multi-stakeholder model to do this is one that would require some thinking through, I think. That's a fair point. Paul.
I hear that, Bill. I think it does require some thinking through. However, to the point that David Cake was making, absolutely, there should not have been any reflection moment in the review process where people said, oh, I'm doing this because the US government told me I need to do it, and I've got a set of accountabilities as a community member to the US government. In fact, we hit on this point earlier, and it's good to hear that this is what your experience was. In fact, those reviews are all about being accountable to the community. They're not about being accountable to the US government. I'll just come back to that point I made earlier, which is the affirmation says, we will recognise you and commit to you as long as you do these things. Right? And it's those things on behalf and remaining accountable to the community is, I think, a really crucial and important point. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure you necessarily need a separate agreement with the community, but to call that out.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Paul.
Sorry,
I need coffee. All right, Vint, I know who you are.
Sometimes I don't know who I am, so that's okay. You're forgiven. I'm not going to try to respond to all the questions. I did want to make one simple observation. An institution has to have a legal home somewhere. And so it's actually pretty important for that legal home to be well defined, because if there are issues arising with such an institution, you want to know in which jurisdiction you can raise concerns. So the fact that ICANN happens to be incorporated in California, I think, is no worse than if it was incorporated in Geneva or, Cape Town or something else. At least it's a well-defined question, a well-defined answer to the question, what's the jurisdiction that controls institutional interaction? I think I'll just stop there because there's so little time for others.
Thank you. Well, I'd like very humbly to say I have more question marks and I will go out of the room with more questions than the ones I had when I came in. But I appreciate I've been learning a lot from you. But I think one of the things was said that maybe this affirmation of commitment model could be replicated. I'm not sure that could be feasible because the affirmation of commitment has some unique features maybe the most prominent of which exactly the notion that ICANN should remain US-based according to the California legislation. I think we are working on the assumption that this will remain, and I think maybe from a realistic perspective, this is something we should not touch. I think we would initiate a discussion that could not politically and even be changed. But if we were in an ideal world, and then I think the affirmation commitment should be replaced by a global pact in which the global community would sit down and revise everything. Nothing should be off limits. And this addresses what Adam Peake was explaining. If it remains under the California law, I don't think there would be a room for government to be sitting on the board. But in an ideal world, if you could rethink and refound this system, nothing should be off limits. We'd like in the process, and this is the matter, not be entangled by this constellation of processes, review teams, and deadlines, and to be under pressure to be so quickly moving and making decisions that will be guiding the process for I think we should make sure that the decision we make is consistent, is sound, that will address the concerns of the multi-stakeholder community at large, and I include the governments in this community. I think sometimes government are not seen part of the community, but I would say governments are also part of the community. And take into account that ICANN is intended to serve the public interest. I can agree that governments maybe do not have the monopoly to identify public, but they have a role. It is kind of strange that in the decision-making process there is no significant input from government, since the organization is intended to serve the public interest. So there are a number of issues that should be maybe further discussed, but I think the main, and we share the purpose to work within this deadline, this time frame, not a deadline, but a time frame, an indicative time frame. So we think we should, all of us, restrict ourselves to the maximum of the scope of discussion that is feasible in that, and we'll be looking very much to work with all of you in that regard. Thank you.
Maybe next year I'll organize a workshop on the ideal world. What could be done in the ideal world? Wouldn't that be an interesting workshop? Okay.
You won't be allowed to, because the IGF is becoming more outcome oriented. Just quickly, I do think that bilateral affirmations of commitment will undermine the multi-stakeholder model. So I am concerned about that, which is why I'd rather explore agreements with groups of governments. And I agree with Vint. I think a legal home is important. I think there are short-term reforms and longer-term reforms. As a short-term reform, I think a consultation, a review, David, wide review can be done. I think changing and amending bylaws there's so much information. There's so much information on which to base such a review, I think can be done. And I think in reviewing that, not just the AOC should be taken into account, but some of this other work. Vince's panel, in my view, did some really significant work. It introduced the idea of the public interest, and ICANN being there to promote an internet that serves that public interest. It also introduces the idea of stewardship. I think these are really significant concepts, and I would like to see the ICANN governance structure reflect all of that input more transparently and more effectively than I feel it does at present.
By the way, just to be fair to Vince's panel, they did recommend also not only bilateral agreements with governments, but also with non-governmental actors. And he started out making the point that the RIRs and others would also be signatories. So whether that would in fact be undermining multi-stakeholder or something, I think it's worth debating. But it's a larger and it's interesting question. This has been, I think, an interesting discussion. I know we went 10 minutes over time. I thank those of you who were able to stay. It was just the beginning of a conversation, obviously. We'll be thinking about this much more. The NCUC also has a workshop tomorrow, if you're interested, at 2:30 on institutionalization of the clearinghouse function, which has been something discussed with regards to the so-called Net Mondiale initiative and other things. So we would welcome your participation there. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.